Smile like you're having a good time. The waitress whispered softly as she placed the glass beside his plate. And whatever you do, don't look up. Ethan Callaway didn't react right away. At 39 years old, the billionaire CEO of Callaway Ventures had mastered the art of hiding emotion in public. Fear, anger, exhaustion. None of it ever reached his face anymore. Especially not tonight. Especially not here. The rooftop restaurant shimmered above Manhattan like a jewel suspended in the clouds. Golden lights reflected off crystal glasses. A jazz piano drifted through the warm night air, while conversations floated between hedge fund managers, celebrity lawyers, and people who measured self-worth in stock options and private jets. Below them, the city pulsed with sirens, headlights, and ambition. But at the corner table near the glass railing, Ethan sat completely alone. One untouched birthday candle flickered beside a half-melted slice of chocolate cake. His phone screen lit up every few seconds. Board members, investors, assistants, automated birthday texts from people who probably wouldn't recognize his laugh anymore. But not one call from family. Not one real message. The richest man in the room looked like the loneliest. Across the dining floor, Naomi Brooks moved carefully between tables carrying a silver tray against one hip. 25 years old. Dark curls tied neatly behind her head. Crisp black uniform. White sneakers soft against the marble floor. Most guests barely noticed her unless they needed another drink poured. That was how places like this worked. People saw uniforms before they saw faces. But Naomi noticed everything. The nervous tapping fingers of cheating husbands. The fake laughter of investors pretending to trust each other. The silent tension between couples who hadn't loved each other in years. And tonight, she noticed something else. The man near the back elevator wearing a charcoal gray coat, even though it was almost 80 degrees outside. He hadn't ordered food. Hadn't touched the water placed in front of him 20 minutes ago. His eyes never wandered toward the skyline or the music or the women passing through the restaurant. In expensive dresses, they stayed fixed on Ethan Callaway. Naomi felt it immediately. Something cold. Something wrong. She lowered her tray slightly and glanced toward the mirrored wine wall beside the bar. In the reflection, she caught a quick metallic glint beneath the stranger's coat before it disappeared again. Her pulse tightened. Keep walking, she told herself. Don't panic. But then the man touched his ear slightly, like he was listening to someone speaking through an earpiece. Naomi's stomach dropped. 3 years ago, her older brother Marcus had died outside a convenience store in Brooklyn after getting caught in the middle of a gang dispute. Since then, Naomi noticed details other people ignored. Exit doors. Hands hidden inside jackets. Faces that scanned rooms too carefully. Fear changed people. Survival sharpened them. She approached Ethan's table slowly, forcing calm into every movement. The candlelight softened the sharp lines of his face. He looked exhausted up close. Not physically. Soul-deep exhausted. The kind money never fixes. Another bourbon, sir? She asked gently. Ethan barely looked at her. Please. His voice was low, distracted. Naomi set the glass down carefully. Then she leaned slightly closer without changing her expression. Smile like you're having a good time, she whispered. And whatever you do, don't look up. Ethan's hand froze around the glass. For the first time all night, his eyes focused completely on someone. What? He muttered under his breath. Naomi kept her smile perfectly professional as she adjusted the napkin near his plate. There's a man in the restaurant watching you, she whispered softly. And I think he's waiting for you to stand up. The jazz music continued. Glasses clinked softly. Somewhere near the bar, a group of investors burst into laughter over a story nobody would remember tomorrow. But at that table, the air changed. Ethan's pulse quickened even though his face stayed still. Years in corporate warfare had taught him when someone was lying. Naomi Brooks was not lying. Who are you? He asked quietly. Naomi stepped back before anyone noticed the tension between them. Just the waitress, she said. But her eyes said something entirely different. Across the restaurant, the man in the gray coat slowly reached beneath the table. The man in the gray coat never ordered dinner. That was the first thing Ethan noticed once Naomi walked away. In a restaurant where people spent $400 on steak and another $1,000 pretending to know wine, the stranger sat completely still with an untouched glass of water sweating beside his hand. Ethan kept his expression calm and lifted the bourbon slowly to his lips. Years of boardroom negotiations had trained him to survive pressure without showing fear, but this was different. This was not a hostile takeover or a shareholder ambush. This felt personal, dangerous in a quieter way. Across the rooftop, Manhattan glittered beneath the summer sky. Helicopter lights drifted between skyscrapers. Yellow cabs crawled through the streets below like rivers of gold. Inside the restaurant, laughter rolled between tables while a saxophone melted softly into the piano music. Nobody noticed the tension tightening around table 17 except Naomi Brooks. She moved carefully between guests, pretending to refill water glasses while her eyes tracked every movement near the back elevator. The man checked his watch once. Then the elevator doors opened again. Another man stepped out wearing a dark baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Naomi felt her throat tighten. Two men now, not one. The second man walked casually toward the bar area, but his gaze swept the room too quickly. Searching, calculating. Naomi had seen that look before. Her brother Marcus used to call it the hunting stare, the look people got right before something bad happened. She grabbed a tray from the kitchen entrance just to keep her hands busy. Calm down, she told herself. Think. Around her, servers floated through the dining floor carrying lobster tails, cocktails, and plates lined with edible gold flakes. The manager was busy charming a celebrity couple near the windows. Security stood downstairs near the lobby entrance, too far away to notice anything happening up here. Naomi glanced toward Ethan again. He had not touched the birthday cake. The single candle had finally burned out completely, leaving a thin curl of smoke rising into the air. For some reason, that bothered her more than anything else. A billionaire sitting alone on his birthday while strangers watched him like prey. It felt wrong. Ethan suddenly spoke without looking at her as she passed beside the table again. Are they still here? His voice stayed low and steady. Naomi adjusted the silverware beside his plate to make it appear normal. Yes, she whispered. And now there are two of them. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. No panic. No sudden movement. But inside, his mind raced through possibilities. He had enemies. Plenty of them. Billion-dollar deals created billion-dollar resentment. 3 weeks ago, he had canceled a merger with a private defense contractor after discovering financial irregularities buried inside offshore accounts. The fallout had been ugly. Threats, lawsuits, anonymous messages sent to his office. At the time, he assumed it was intimidation. Now he was no longer sure. Naomi leaned closer for only a second. Do not stand up, she whispered. The man near the elevator keeps watching your chair. Ethan looked at his reflection in the window instead of turning around directly. In the glass, he caught the faint outline of the stranger adjusting something beneath the table. A chill moved down his spine. You should leave, he said quietly. Naomi almost laughed at that. Leave. As if people like her could simply walk away from danger whenever they wanted. If I leave, she whispered, you are alone. Ethan looked at her then. Really looked at her for the first time all night. Not the uniform. Not the tray in her hands. Her. She looked young, but there was something older behind her eyes. Something tired. The kind of tired that came from surviving things nobody should survive. Before Ethan could respond, loud laughter exploded near the center table where a group of finance executives toasted another deal. One of them snapped his fingers sharply toward Naomi. Hey, sweetheart, the man called carelessly. We asked for another bottle 10 minutes ago. Naomi stiffened slightly but forced a polite smile. Ethan noticed the change. Immediately, the way her shoulders tightened. The way humiliation flashed across her face before disappearing behind professionalism. Invisible people learned how to hide pain quickly. I will be right there, sir, she answered calmly. The executive waved dismissively without even looking at her again. Ethan watched Naomi walk toward the bar, and for the first time in years, something unfamiliar settled heavily inside his chest. Guilt. Because he realized with sudden clarity that he had probably ignored people exactly the same way his entire life. Across the restaurant, the man in the gray coat slowly stood up from his chair. The chair scraped softly against the marble floor as the man in the gray coat rose to his feet. It was such a small sound, barely noticeable beneath the music and conversation. But Naomi heard it instantly. Her eyes flicked toward him while she uncorked a bottle of Cabernet for the finance executives near the center table. The man adjusted his jacket once, then began walking slowly across the restaurant. Not rushed, not nervous. Calm people were always the most dangerous. Ethan kept his posture relaxed even as his heartbeat started climbing harder inside his chest. Every instinct told him to stand up and leave immediately, but Naomi's warning echoed in his mind. Do not stand up. The rooftop suddenly felt smaller than before. The candle beside his untouched cake had burned itself into a puddle of wax. Outside the glass walls, thunderclouds rolled quietly over the Hudson River, swallowing pieces of the skyline inch by inch. The city lights blurred against the darkening sky like smeared gold paint. Naomi forced herself to breathe steadily. Think. Her manager, Leonard, passed beside her carrying a tablet. Table 12 needs another champagne tower, he muttered impatiently. And smile more tonight. We have important people here. Naomi almost looked at him in disbelief. Important people. As if danger cared about wealth. As if expensive suits could stop tragedy. Leonard, she whispered quickly, I think something is wrong. But Leonard barely paused. Not now, Naomi. Then he disappeared toward the kitchen doors without another glance. Of course. Nobody listened to waitresses unless a glass broke. The man in the gray coat continued moving through the dining room. Ethan tracked him carefully using the reflection in the windows instead of turning directly. 20 feet away now. Maybe less. The second man, near the bar, adjusted his baseball cap and casually shifted position closer toward the main staircase. Coordinated. Ethan saw it clearly now. His pulse hammered once against his ribs. Naomi crossed toward his table, carrying another tray she did not need. Her hands looked calm, but inside she felt every nerve tightening like piano wire. Listen carefully, she whispered while pretending to clear his empty appetizer plate. There are 2 exits behind the kitchen. Ethan kept his face neutral. You think they are after me because of business? Naomi swallowed softly. I think they came here for you specifically. Ethan stared ahead at the skyline for a long second. Somewhere below them, a police siren wailed through the streets before fading into the distance. Strange how normal the world kept moving while fear quietly settled over one table. You should not be involved in this, he said quietly. Naomi almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because rich people always thought danger belonged only to them once it entered the room. Too late, she answered softly. The man in the gray coat suddenly stopped beside a nearby pillar only 10 feet from Ethan's table. Close enough now that Naomi could see a faint scar along his jawline. His eyes scanned the restaurant once more before landing directly on Ethan. Cold eyes. Empty eyes. Naomi's stomach dropped. Then the stranger reached into his coat. Time slowed instantly. The jazz music. The candle smoke. The soft clinking of silverware. Everything narrowed into one terrifying moment. Naomi reacted before she even thought about it. She spun sharply and accidentally slammed her tray into the edge of a waiter station beside her. Glasses shattered loudly across the marble floor. Red wine splashed across a customer's white designer suit. The restaurant erupted with startled gasps. Several guests jumped to their feet at once. The piano player stopped. Mid-song. Watch where you are going, someone shouted angrily. Naomi ignored the voices. Her eyes locked onto the man in gray. His hand immediately withdrew from inside his coat as attention flooded toward the sudden commotion. Not now, his expression seemed to say. Not with everyone looking. Security guards downstairs finally glanced upward toward the noise. The stranger cursed under his breath and turned away sharply, disappearing toward the elevator corridor before anyone could stop him. Near the bar, the second man lowered his head and moved quickly toward the stairwell exit. Gone within seconds. Silence lingered across the rooftop after the commotion faded. Broken glass glittered across the floor like ice under the chandelier lights. Naomi stood frozen beside the spilled wine, breathing hard. Customers stared at her with irritation and annoyance. One woman dabbed red wine from her dress while muttering about incompetent staff. Nobody realized what had almost happened. Nobody except Ethan. He stared at Naomi across the chaos with something unfamiliar in his eyes now. Not curiosity. Not suspicion. Respect. Real respect. Leonard stormed across the floor furious. Naomi, what on earth is wrong with you tonight? He snapped loudly. Do you realize how expensive that bottle was? Naomi opened her mouth, but Ethan stood up before she could speak. The entire restaurant turned silent again. Ethan reached calmly into his jacket, pulled out a black credit card, and placed it onto the table beside Leonard. Charge me for every damaged bottle in this room, he said quietly. Then he looked directly at Naomi. Because she just saved my life. The words landed harder than the sound of breaking glass. For a moment, nobody in the restaurant moved. Leonard blinked at Ethan like he had heard the wrong sentence. Several guests exchanged confused looks while servers stood frozen beside half-filled wine glasses and silver trays. Save my life. Naomi herself looked stunned, hearing it spoken out loud. Because suddenly the fear she had been carrying alone for the past 20 minutes became real for everyone else too. Ethan kept his hand resting calmly against the table, but inside, adrenaline still moved through him like electricity. He had spent years controlling rooms filled with powerful men. Politicians, investors, executives who smiled during meetings while planning betrayals underneath the table. But none of them had ever looked at him the way those men did tonight. Not with negotiation, not with anger, with intent. Leonard lowered his voice immediately. Sir, should I call the police? Ethan glanced toward the elevator corridor where the stranger had disappeared moments earlier. Empty now? Quiet. Yes, he answered calmly. And lock the rooftop exits until they arrive. The manager nodded quickly and rushed away, suddenly transformed from irritated supervisor into frightened employee. Funny how fast people listened once danger attached itself to money. Naomi bent carefully beside the broken glass scattered across the marble floor. Her hands trembled slightly now that the immediate threat had passed. A few customers still stared at her with annoyance instead of gratitude. One woman whispered loudly enough to be heard. This is why upscale places are impossible to maintain anymore. Naomi kept cleaning silently. She was used to that tone, the kind that made you feel small without ever using a single curse word. Ethan watched her for several long seconds before speaking again. Leave the glass, he said quietly. Naomi looked up. It is my job. No, Ethan answered softly. Your job tonight was serving dinner. What you did was something else. The jazz musicians near the stage began playing again hesitantly, trying to restore normalcy to a room that no longer felt normal. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations stayed quieter now. Nervous. Careful. People checked their phones more often. Some guests requested their checks early. Wealthy people loved luxury until luxury stopped feeling safe. Ethan slowly sat back down at the table and loosened his tie slightly for the first time all evening. The city lights outside blurred against the dark glass as rain finally began tapping softly against the rooftop windows. Naomi stood there uncertainly, still holding a white cloth stained red with wine. Sit down for a minute, Ethan said. Her eyes widened immediately. I cannot do that. Why not? Because people like me do not sit with people like you. The honesty in her answer hit harder than he expected. Ethan glanced around the restaurant. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before. Not investors, not assistants, not board members terrified of losing access to his money. But Naomi Brooks looked directly at him without fear now, like she had already decided his status meant nothing compared to survival. Ethan pulled out the empty chair across from him anyway. Tonight you do. Naomi hesitated. Every instinct told her not to cross that line. Employees did not sit with billionaires in places like this. Especially black waitresses from Brooklyn carrying broken glass cuts across their fingertips. But then she looked around the restaurant again. At the stairs. At the whispers. At the people who suddenly saw her only because something terrible almost happened near her. Slowly, cautiously, she sat down. The rooftop seemed to pause around them. Ethan noticed details about her now that he had never trained himself to notice before. The faint scar near her wrist. The exhaustion beneath her eyes hidden under makeup. The way she scanned exits automatically every few seconds without realizing it. Survival habits. How did you know? He asked quietly. Naomi looked down briefly at the rain sliding across the windows. My brother used to tell me that dangerous people move differently, she answered softly. Too calm. Too focused. Like they already made peace with whatever happens next. Ethan stayed silent. Naomi's voice remained steady, but grief lingered beneath every word. Marcus died 6 years ago, she continued. Wrong place. Wrong time. After that, I started noticing things. The candle wax beside Ethan's untouched cake hardened quietly under the dim restaurant lights. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low across Manhattan. Ethan stared at the cake for a moment before speaking. You know what is strange? Naomi looked at him carefully. Tonight was the first birthday dinner I ever attended where nobody actually wanted me there. He said with a faint smile that never reached. His eyes. Most people only wanted access to what I own. Naomi studied him for a second. Then she asked softly, "And what about you?" Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean? What do you want?" The question caught him completely off guard. Billionaires got asked about markets, acquisitions, forecasts. Nobody ever asked what they wanted anymore. Not really. Ethan looked out at the storm darkening the skyline. Then he answered with quiet honesty that surprised even himself. "I think," he said slowly, "I just wanted somebody to remember it was my birthday." For a second, Naomi forgot who he was. Not the billionaire CEO from magazine covers. Not the man investors called ruthless behind closed doors. Just a tired man sitting alone beside a dead birthday candle while rain slid down the glass behind him. The confession hung quietly between them. "I just wanted somebody to remember it was my birthday." Naomi looked at the untouched chocolate cake again. The writing in white icing had already begun smearing slightly from the warmth of the rooftop lights. "Happy birthday, Ethan." Simple words. Expensive cake. Empty chair across from him until tonight. "I remembered," Naomi said softly before she could stop herself. Ethan looked up at her immediately. Something in his expression shifted then. Small but real. Like a crack appearing inside concrete. Around them, the restaurant slowly tried returning to normal. Servers replaced broken glasses. Guests resumed conversations in quieter voices. The piano player moved into a softer song, while thunder rolled farther downtown. But the atmosphere never fully recovered. Fear had entered the room once. People could feel it lingering like smoke. Leonard approached the table cautiously this time. His nervous smile looked stretched too tight. "Sir, security is reviewing the cameras now," he said quietly. "Police are on the way." Ethan nodded once. "Good." Leonard glanced awkwardly toward Naomi sitting across from him. A waitress at a guest table inside one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants looked almost scandalous to him. But after tonight, he no longer knew the rules. "Naomi," he said carefully, "you can take your break now." She almost laughed hearing that. A break. As if her body understood how to relax anymore. "Thank you," she answered quietly. Leonard hesitated another second before lowering his voice. "And I am sorry I did not listen earlier." Naomi blinked in surprise. Managers rarely apologize to employees like her, especially in places where rich customers mattered more than the people carrying plates. Leonard gave a small nod and walked away again. Ethan noticed the look on Naomi's face immediately. "People do not apologize often around here?" he asked. Naomi let out a faint breath through her nose. "Not to people wearing aprons." The honesty of it settled heavily between them again. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the room around him with different eyes now. He had eaten in luxury restaurants all over the world. Paris, Dubai, Tokyo, places where people memorized his preferences before he even sat down. But tonight was the first time he noticed the servers looked exhausted before the dinner rush even ended. The first time he noticed how invisible they became once the food reached the table. Naomi glanced toward the rain outside. "You know what is strange?" she asked softly. Ethan gave a faint nod. "Most nights in this restaurant, people look right through me." She folded the damp cloth carefully between her hands. "Tonight, everybody finally noticed me because something terrible almost happened." Ethan stayed silent because he knew she was right. Power noticed people only when they became useful, dangerous, or impossible to ignore. The rest of the time, the world moved around them without slowing down. A police siren echoed faintly somewhere below the building. Closer now. Naomi's shoulders tightened automatically at the sound. Ethan noticed. "You do not like police?" he asked carefully. Naomi stared at the table for a moment before answering. When Marcus died, officers questioned everybody in the neighborhood except the people who actually saw what happened. Her voice stayed calm, but sadness lived underneath every word. After a while, you stop expecting protection. Ethan looked down slowly at his own hands resting against the tablecloth. Expensive. Watch. Tailored sleeves. Hands that signed billion-dollar contracts while other people worried about surviving subway rides home after midnight. The difference between their worlds suddenly felt enormous. And uncomfortable. "You should not have had to protect me tonight," he said quietly. Naomi looked directly at him. "Maybe not. But I did." Neither of them spoke for several seconds after that. The rain intensified against the windows, turning Manhattan into blurred rivers of red and white lights below the rooftop. Somewhere near the kitchen, a dishwasher crashed loudly, making several guests jump again. Fear still sat close to the surface tonight. Ethan finally reached for the small birthday cake beside him. Do you know something funny? Naomi tilted her head slightly. This cake cost $300, he said. And somehow it still feels sad. Naomi laughed softly before she could stop herself. A real laugh this time. Warm, tired, human. Ethan stared at her for a second, surprised by how rare genuine laughter sounded in places like this. Most laughter in rooms full of wealthy people came rehearsed, strategic, measured. But Naomi's laugh sounded honest. And honesty had become rare in Ethan's life. He picked up the untouched candle carefully and held it out toward her. Then maybe, he said quietly, I should try making a better wish. Naomi stared at the candle in Ethan's hand while thunder rolled softly beyond the rooftop windows. The tiny flame had already died once tonight, leaving behind only smoke and melted wax. Somehow that felt symbolic. People like Ethan Callaway were surrounded by attention every day of their lives, yet loneliness still found them somehow. Quietly, patiently, like rain finding cracks in glass. A better wish? Naomi asked softly. Ethan gave a faint smile. The last few years, my wishes mostly involved stock prices and quarterly reports. He looked down at the cake again. Turns out none of that helps much when you are sitting alone at your own birthday dinner. Naomi did not know what to say to that. She had spent most of her life worrying about rent payments, subway delays, and whether her paycheck would stretch through the month. Loneliness looked different in her world. Smaller apartments, empty refrigerators, missed calls from family members too exhausted to talk. But somehow the sadness in Ethan's voice still sounded familiar. The police finally arrived upstairs moments later. 2 officers stepped onto the rooftop accompanied by building security. Their dark uniforms immediately shifted the mood of the restaurant again. Guests lowered their voices. Some discreetly reached for their coats. Wealthy people loved the idea of danger far more than the reality of police reports and witness statements. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with tired eyes named Detective Ruiz, approached Ethan's table carefully. Mr. Callaway, he said, we reviewed the lobby footage downstairs. Looks like the 2 men left the building less than 3 minutes after the disturbance. Ethan nodded once. Did you identify them? Ruiz shook his head. Not yet. But your security team mentioned recent threats connected to your canceled defense contract. Naomi noticed Ethan's jaw tighten slightly. I assumed they were bluffing, he admitted quietly. Ruiz looked toward Naomi then. You are the employee who noticed the suspects? Naomi straightened instinctively. Yes, sir. You may have saved multiple people tonight, the detective said calmly. If those men panicked in a crowded rooftop like this, he stopped himself before finishing the sentence. He did not need to. Everyone at the table understood. Naomi looked down at her hands. Her fingertips still carried tiny cuts from cleaning shattered glass earlier. Ethan noticed immediately. You are bleeding, he said. Naomi glanced quickly at the small red marks and shrugged lightly. It is nothing. But Ethan reached for a folded linen napkin anyway and handed it to her across the table. The gesture was simple, quiet. Yet Naomi froze for half a second before accepting it. People like Ethan usually handed out business cards. Orders. Instructions. Not care. Detective Ruiz studied the interaction silently before speaking again. Miss Brooks, we may need an official statement later tonight. Naomi nodded. Okay. The detective handed Ethan his card before stepping aside to speak with building security near the entrance. Rain continued streaking down the windows while lightning flashed faintly above the river. The rooftop crowd had thinned considerably now. Several tables sat empty, abandoned meals cooling beneath dim candlelight. Manhattan no longer looked glamorous tonight. It looked cold. Ethan leaned back in his chair and loosened his cuff links slowly. You know, he said quietly, most people in my life would have left the second things became dangerous. Naomi folded the napkin gently around her fingertips. Fear makes people selfish. Ethan looked at her carefully. And what does fear make you? Naomi thought about Marcus. About her mother working double nursing shifts for 20 years straight. About nights riding the subway home gripping pepper spray inside her coat pocket while strangers stared too long. Fear had shaped her entire life. But it had not made her cruel. Careful, she answered softly. Not cold. Just careful. Ethan stared at her for a long moment after that. The honesty in her voice unsettled him because it reminded him how different their worlds truly were. His life had been built around controlling risk. Lawyers, drivers, private elevators, security briefings. Naomi's life involved surviving risks nobody protected her from in the first place. Leonard suddenly approached again, carrying a small lighter. The kitchen made a fresh candle, he said awkwardly. On the house this time. Ethan almost smiled hearing that. Leonard carefully placed the new candle into the center of the cake before stepping away again. The tiny flame flickered warmly between Ethan and Naomi while the storm darkened outside. Ethan looked at the candle for a second before speaking quietly. Would it be strange if I asked a waitress to help me blow out a birthday candle? Naomi blinked in surprise. Probably, she admitted. Ethan gave a faint laugh under his breath. Good. I am tired of normal tonight. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway closed his eyes before making a wish. And sitting across from him beneath the rooftop lights, Naomi Brooks silently hoped whatever he wished for had nothing to do with money. The candle flickered softly between them before both of them leaned forward at the same time. One breath. One quiet moment. The flame disappeared instantly, leaving only a thin ribbon of smoke curling into the warm rooftop air. Naomi smiled faintly without realizing it. Ethan noticed immediately. It changed her entire face. For the first time all night, she did not look tense or exhausted or prepared to run toward danger. She looked young, human, real. There, Ethan said quietly. Now at least somebody was here for it. Naomi lowered her eyes for a second, almost embarrassed by how much that sentence affected her. Around them, the restaurant continued, emptying slowly while rain tapped against the windows harder now. The city below had dissolved into blurred colors and reflections. Midnight was getting closer. Most of the staff had started resetting tables for the next day. But nobody rushed Naomi anymore. Nobody ordered her around with snapping fingers or impatient sighs. After tonight, the entire rooftop looked at her differently. Some with gratitude, others with curiosity, a few with discomfort. Because courage unsettled people who spent their lives pretending money solved everything. Ethan cut a small piece of cake and pushed the plate gently toward Naomi. You should have some. Naomi immediately shook her head. I cannot eat with guests. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. You already sat with one. She almost laughed again at that. You are not letting the rules survive tonight, are you? The rules almost got me killed, Ethan answered calmly. I am reevaluating them. Naomi stared at him for a moment before taking the fork carefully. The cake tasted expensive. Rich dark chocolate layered with raspberry filling and gold flakes thin enough to disappear against the tongue. Probably the most expensive dessert Naomi had ever eaten in her life. But somehow it was not the price she noticed. It was the silence around it. No performance. No networking. No pretending. Just two tired people sharing birthday cake, while rain covered Manhattan outside. Ethan studied her quietly across the table. Do you always notice danger this fast? Naomi swallowed carefully. Before answering. No. She looked toward the storm beyond the windows. Just loneliness. Ethan frowned slightly. What does that mean? Naomi rested the fork against the plate softly. People sitting alone usually notice things before everyone else does. Ethan stayed silent because deep down, he understood exactly what she meant. Lonely people watched rooms differently. They studied expressions longer. They heard changes in tone quicker. Isolation sharpened awareness the same way grief did. One of the younger servers suddenly approached the table carrying Naomi's coat. Leonard said you can head home early tonight, the girl whispered softly. Naomi blinked in surprise. Early? That almost never happened. Thank you, she said gently while taking the coat. The young server hesitated awkwardly before adding, what you did tonight was really brave. Then she walked away quickly before Naomi could respond. Brave. Naomi was not sure she liked that word. Brave people in her life usually ended up hurt. Marcus used to be brave too. Ethan noticed the sadness returning behind her eyes. You miss him a lot, do not you? He asked softly. Naomi nodded once. Every day. Thunder rolled again across the skyline, lower this time. The rooftop lights dimmed briefly before stabilizing again. Ethan looked at the rain for a long moment before speaking carefully. My father used to tell me something when I was younger. Naomi listened quietly. He said the loneliest people are usually the ones everybody assumes are doing fine. A faint smile crossed Ethan's face, but it looked tired. Back then I thought he was talking about rich people. He glanced toward Naomi gently. Turns out he was talking about everyone. Naomi looked down at the empty dessert plate between them. Nobody had ever spoken to her like this before. Not like an equal. Not like her thoughts mattered inside the conversation. Most wealthy customers treated service workers like background music, useful when needed, invisible the rest of the time. But Ethan kept looking directly at her every time she spoke, as if listening carefully mattered more than status. Detective Ruiz returned a few minutes later holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a silver cuff link engraved with unfamiliar initials. Security found this near the emergency stairwell, he explained quietly. Might belong to one of the suspects. Ethan studied it carefully, but did not recognize the initials. Ruiz slipped the bag back into his coat pocket. We will increase patrols around your office and residence for the next few days, he said. Then he looked toward Naomi. And Miss Brooks. Naomi straightened slightly. Yes. The detective gave her a respectful nod. You trusted your instincts tonight when nobody else did. A lot of people are alive because of that. After he walked away, silence settled over the table again. Ethan looked at Naomi carefully beneath the dim rooftop lights. You know, he said softly, most people spend their whole lives trying to be noticed. Naomi slipped her coat over her shoulders slowly. And Ethan's expression softened. You spent yours protecting people who never even saw you. By the time Naomi stepped into the service elevator, it was almost 1 in the morning. The rooftop restaurant above her still glowed with gold light and muted jazz, but down inside the narrow elevator, everything felt quieter, smaller, real again. She leaned her head gently against the steel wall and closed her eyes for a moment while the elevator descended floor by floor through the building. Her feet ached. Her hands still smelled faintly like wine and candle smoke. Somewhere above her, billionaires were finishing expensive dinners under crystal chandeliers. Somewhere below, subway trains rattled through dark tunnels carrying exhausted workers home across the city. Manhattan always looked glamorous from rooftops. It felt different underground. The elevator doors opened into the employee corridor near the kitchen loading dock. Harsh fluorescent lights replaced the warm glow of the restaurant upstairs. The air smelled like bleach, rainwater, and burnt coffee left too long on a warmer. Naomi adjusted her coat and walked toward the locker room quietly. But tonight, people looked at her differently. A dishwasher stopped mopping for a second just to nod respectfully at her. One of the bartenders gave her a small smile. Even the security guard near the back exit straightened when she passed. Word had already spread downstairs. The waitress saved the billionaire. Naomi hated how strange that sounded. Inside the locker room, she sat slowly on the wooden bench beside her locker and stared at herself in the mirror. Same dark curls, same tired eyes, same black uniform with tiny wine stains near the sleeves. Nothing about her looked heroic. She still looked like a woman who had to catch the downtown train home before service workers filled the late-night platforms. Her phone buzzed softly inside her bag. One unread text from her mother. You working late again, baby? Naomi smiled faintly at the message. Her mother still called her baby, even at 25 years old. Naomi typed back quickly. Yeah, long night. I will be home soon. 3 dots appeared immediately on the screen before another message arrived. Be careful on the train. Always. Naomi stared at those 2 words for a second longer than she expected. Always. For women like her, safety was never assumed. It was practiced, learned, repeated every day like survival prayer. Keep your keys between your fingers. Avoid empty subway cars. Watch people's hands. Notice exits. Be careful. Always. Upstairs, Ethan stood alone near the rooftop windows after Detective Ruiz finally left. Most of the guests were gone now. Chairs sat empty beneath dim hanging lights while rain covered the glass in silver streaks. The city looked softer after midnight. Less arrogant somehow. Leonard approached carefully holding Ethan's coat. Your driver is waiting downstairs, sir. Ethan nodded absently, but did not move right away. His reflection stared back at him through the rain-dark window. Expensive suit. Perfect haircut. $1 billion reputation. Yet somehow the only real conversation he had experienced all year came from a waitress who almost nobody in the restaurant noticed before tonight. Sir? Leonard asked gently. Ethan looked toward the empty chair across from his table. Naomi's chair. The plate they shared still sat there with 2 small bites of chocolate cake remaining beside the extinguished candle. Do you know her well? Ethan asked suddenly. Leonard blinked in surprise. Naomi. Yes. Leonard loosened his tie slightly before answering. She has worked here almost 2 years. He hesitated. Always early. Never complains. Covers shifts nobody else wants. Ethan listened quietly. Leonard lowered his voice. Truthfully, sir, people here probably take her for granted. Ethan almost laughed at the understatement. Probably. Leonard glanced toward the elevator. She should have been promoted months ago. But customers tend to request a certain image on the rooftop level. The sentence hung awkwardly between them. Ethan understood exactly what Leonard meant without needing further explanation. Certain image. Polite corporate language for prejudice expensive enough to wear designer shoes. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He looked back toward the skyline again. And what image is that? Leonard looked uncomfortable now. Older clients sometimes prefer servers who look more. He stopped himself. More what? Ethan wondered silently. More acceptable? More invisible? More white? Rain tapped steadily against the rooftop glass, while silence settled heavily between them. Finally, Ethan spoke quietly. Tonight, the only person in this building who noticed danger before it arrived was the woman everybody underestimated. Leonard lowered his eyes. Ethan took his coat slowly and headed toward the elevator. But before stepping inside, he paused. Make sure Naomi Brooks gets home safely tonight, he said calmly. Not because she saved my life. He glanced once more toward the empty rooftop behind him. Because somebody should have cared about her safety long before tonight. Down on 42nd Street, Naomi stepped out beneath the cold rain, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Taxis splashed through puddles, while steam rose from subway grates into the dark Manhattan air. She began walking toward the station alone, unaware that high above the street, Ethan Calloway stood beneath the building awning watching until she safely disappeared into the city crowd. 3 days later, the video was everywhere. Not the security footage itself. The restaurant refused to release that. But cell phone clips from frightened guests had already spread across social media before midnight that night. Grainy videos showed shattered wine glasses across the marble floor. Panicked customers turning toward the commotion. A billionaire standing protectively beside a black waitress while police officers searched the rooftop in the background. The internet filled the missing pieces on its own. Headlines exploded by sunrise. Black waitress prevents possible attack on billionaire CEO. Mysterious hero at Manhattan rooftop restaurant. Woman staff member praised after sensing danger before security. But the most viewed clip showed something much simpler. Ethan Calloway standing beside Naomi Brooks while she still held the broken tray in her shaking hands. The billionaire looked directly at the crowd and said quietly, "She just saved my life." Millions of people watched those 6 words. Naomi almost dropped her coffee the first time she saw the video replaying on a television above the diner near her apartment. Construction workers paused mid-breakfast to watch the story. A woman near the register whispered, "That poor girl looked terrified." Naomi pulled her hood lower and stared down into her paper cup. She hated attention. Attention changed things. Attention made people stare too long. Her phone had not stopped buzzing since the story broke online. Unknown numbers. News stations. Social media messages from strangers calling her brave. But there were other messages too. Angry ones. Suspicious ones. People questioning why a waitress noticed danger before professional security did. Naomi turned her phone face down against the table and sighed softly. The diner smelled like syrup and burnt bacon. Outside, New York rushed forward like it always did. Horns. Steam. Crowded sidewalks. Nobody slowed down for very long in this city. Not even after fear. Across Manhattan, Ethan sat inside a glass conference room 30 stories above the financial district while board members argued around him. Charts glowed across giant screens. Lawyers discussed liability concerns connected to the attempted attack. Public relations executives pushed statements across the polished table. "We need to control the narrative before investors panic," one man insisted. Another adjusted his tie nervously. "You should avoid public appearances for at least a few weeks." Ethan listened silently for almost 20 minutes before finally speaking. "Has anyone here asked how Naomi Brooks is doing?" The room fell quiet instantly. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman cleared her throat awkwardly. "Our team sent flowers to the restaurant." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Flowers, like gratitude, could be outsourced through a corporate assistant. "She protected me while everyone else focused on stock prices," he said quietly. "The least we can do is treat her like a human being." Nobody answered after that. Because deep down, everyone at the table understood he was right. Ethan left the meeting early for the first time in years. No interviews. No cameras. No press statement. Just a black SUV moving through rainy Manhattan streets toward Brooklyn. Naomi had just finished her shift at a small neighborhood cafe later that evening when she noticed the vehicle parked across the street. Expensive. Glossy. Completely out of place beside the laundromat and corner grocery store. Ethan stepped out holding a small white bakery box beneath one arm. Naomi blinked in disbelief. "You tracked me down?" she asked as he approached. Ethan looked faintly embarrassed. "Your manager gave me the address after making me promise not to bring reporters." Naomi crossed her arms lightly. "And did you?" "No reporters." He held up the bakery box gently. "Just cake." Naomi stared at him for a second before laughing softly despite herself. Rain dripped from the fire escapes above them while neon signs reflected across wet sidewalks. This was not the rooftop restaurant anymore. No chandeliers. No jazz music. Just Brooklyn at night. Real and loud and alive. Ethan glanced toward the small cafe behind her. "You work 2 jobs?" Naomi shrugged lightly. Rent in New York does not care about near-death experiences. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. Real laughter this time. Not rehearsed. Not strategic. Just human. Naomi noticed immediately. He looked different here somehow. Less polished. Less untouchable. A man instead of a headline. Ethan handed her the bakery box carefully. "I realized something after that night," he said softly. Naomi looked at him curiously. "What?" Ethan glanced up at the rainy city sky before answering. "Power can buy protection. Influence. Buildings with private elevators and armed security." He looked back at her gently. But none of that mattered when danger walked into the room. Naomi stayed quiet. Ethan's voice lowered slightly. "The only reason I made it home that night was because someone the world overlooked decided my life still mattered." Rain tapped softly against parked cars around them while the city hummed in the distance. Naomi looked down at the bakery box in her hands. Simple chocolate cake from a neighborhood bakery. Nothing expensive this time. No gold flakes. No rooftop skyline. Somehow it felt warmer already. Ethan smiled faintly. "I thought maybe birthdays work better when somebody actually shares them with you." And standing there beneath the rain-soaked Brooklyn streetlights, Naomi Brooks realized something unexpected. Sometimes the people who save us are not the ones with power. Sometimes they are simply the ones who choose to see us when nobody else does.